What is the Heart Sutra's role in the history of Buddhist ideas? How does it fit into that history and change things in an important way? In my last video, I discussed a bit of the history of the Heart Sutra and what it was taken to mean by some early Buddhist commentators. If you haven't seen that video, I'll leave a link to it down below in the notes. It's probably a good starting place for this, although it's not necessary to have watched it. But anyway, in this video, I want to discuss that role, again, in the history of the Buddhist Dharma. The Heart Sutra is a powerful, memorable text. In translator and scholar Red Pine's words, the Heart Sutra is Buddhism in a nutshell. It covers more of the Buddha's teachings in a shorter span than any other scripture. The point I want to get to at the end of this video is that Red Pine's claims here are deeply problematic in certain respects from a historical perspective. But let's turn here to the framing of the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra begins with Avalokiteshvara schooling Sariputra, the Buddha's right-hand disciple and considered to be foremost in wisdom. He's schooling that disciple on the perfection of wisdom itself. Avalokiteshvara is presented here as being superior even to the most superior of the Buddha's disciples in respect of wisdom. Indeed, Sariputra himself is described here as ignorant about wisdom, about the perfection of wisdom. This bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, exemplifies the Mahayana path, and Sariputra himself exemplifies the earlier path, the path of the Shravakas or disciples who were being schooled in wisdom and who were on the way out. That is the way they are presented. As scholar Donald Lopez says, the wisest of the Buddha's Hinayana disciples must have the sublime teachings of the Mahayana explained to him, sometimes repeatedly. Therefore, the Mahayana is more profound than anything contained in the Hinayana canon. The Hinayana Arhat has more to learn. Sariputra has wisdom, but lacks the perfection of wisdom. First, we may want to reflect upon Lopez's unself-conscious use of the term Hinayana, or lesser vehicle, which is a derogatory term that's used in the Mahayana to describe what they took to be the lesser teachings of the Buddha's disciples. That is to say, Donald Lopez seems to accept this kind of polemical framing of the issues here. Denigration of Sariputra is one of the tropes used in the early Mahayana to describe these followers of the Shravakas, of the disciples of the Buddha. Even though in the early texts there is literally no daylight between Sariputra's understanding of the Dharma and the Buddha's own. Now, why is this? Because in these texts, Shariputra was taken to be a metonym, essentially, for the Abhidharma. That is, he was the main exponent of this Abhidharma. So what's being really done here is that the perfection of wisdom texts are denigrating this Abhidharma viewpoint of the Dharma itself. In particular, the attack is on the Abhidharma of one of the most famous and influential schools of early Buddhism, the Sarvastivada, that existed for around 1,000 years. The sutra starts off with a bang, where Avalokiteshvara says that these aggregates are not as the Sarvastivada Abhidharma says that they are. They lacked self-existence. Immediately, the sutra begins by saying that the Sarvastivadins got things fundamentally wrong about the Dharma. Then later on in the sutra, we see an implicit attack on the early Buddhist notion of nirvana and this idea that the enlightened being after death cannot have any influence in the world anymore. The claim that emptiness is form is taken to mean that through emptiness, an enlightened being can have an influence after passing away in the world and can continue to make its mark. The sutra continues on with an explicit derailing of a number of early Buddhist concepts, such as the Noble Truths, such as dependent origination, such as even change itself. As Red Pine says, Since the defining characteristic of all dharmas is their emptiness, they cannot be purified, nor can they be defiled. Thus, the reason the doctrine of suffering no longer applies is that there is nothing that suffers. With no suffering, of course, there's no need for a path that takes us across the river of suffering to the farther shore of nirvana. And this is all finally encompassed by a single mantra, which itself is said to heal all suffering. Red Pine notes how, in the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's first sermon, where he lays out the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, is known as the first turning of this wheel of the Dharma, whereas the Prajnaparamita is known as the second turning of the wheel. In this sense, the Prajnaparamita, which is what the Heart Sutra expresses in essence, should be taken to, and is taken to be, a kind of a whole-scale reinterpretation or re-understanding of the Buddha's message, where the Buddha's literal message is understood simply to have been a kind of a skillful means, as the Lotus Sutra will say, that is intended for those of lesser understanding, while the true message is that presented by the Prajnaparamita. Now again, these are really powerful claims, and how are they justified? Well, typically in Buddhism, these kinds of claims are justified as through a distinction, an understanding of a distinction between what we might term purely intellectual understanding and a deeper, more experiential knowing of the way things are. And in Buddhism, typically it's the latter that is understood to be much more reliable. Simple intellectual knowing is only surface knowing, whereas the true deep understanding is what really counts. For one example of this, the mantra that ends the sutra, the famous mantra, is not for intellectual understanding, but is intended to be understood more deeply in a kind of obscure, direct knowing. And along those same lines, Red Pine says of the Prajnaparamita that it's born of yogic insight rather than philosophical speculation. And the implicit contrast here that I think Red Pine is trying to make is between that and the Abhidharma, which is understood to be philosophical and speculative and not something that's understood through this kind of direct insight. But we have to be very careful here, because these kinds of claims in Buddhism are often rhetorical. That is, they're often made in defense of a particular viewpoint or position. And indeed, the very same claims are made typically in defense of the Abhidharma itself. The Abhidharma is also said by its proponents to be understood by direct meditative knowing rather than through simple philosophical speculation. For one example of this, we can go to a passage from contemporary scholar and translator Bhikkhu Bodhi when he discusses the Theravada Abhidharma. He says that the Abhidharma is not a figment of speculative thought, not a mosaic put together out of metaphysical hypotheses, but a disclosure of the true nature of existence as apprehended by a mind that has penetrated the totality of things, both in depth and in the finest detail. Indeed, similar things would likely have been said by the Sarvastivada Abhidharmikas themselves. All Buddhist systems rely both upon this kind of direct insight and on conceptual analysis. Indeed, the basic points that underpin the Heart Sutra and the Prajnaparamita literature depend upon this kind of conceptual analysis as well. The conceptual analysis of non-self, what non-self really means. The strategy of the Prajnaparamita literature is to extend this concept of non-self to all dharmas, to view all dharmas as empty of self. That is, that they all express this concept of emptiness. And this conceptual understanding constituted a critical point of debate between people who were disaffected members of the Abhidharma and the people who believed in the Abhidharma, where these disaffected followers of the Prajnaparamita tried to press this idea of non-self through the concepts of each of these dharmas to show the extent of this concept of non-self and how it applied to all things. In other words, these followers saw the concept of emptiness as contradicting key points in the Sarvastivada Abhidharma. That is, they were also pursuing a philosophical path of consistency, of self-consistency, of looking for consistency in our beliefs and our views, and saying there were inconsistencies between viewpoints of these dharmas and this idea of emptiness. How do we bring these inconsistencies to resolution? By pushing out emptiness to all parts. And in the case of the Heart Sutra, this kind of consistency is pushed out to an extreme, to the point of paradox or even its own kind of self-contradiction. Because after all, how can there be true healing of suffering, as the sutra claims the mantra can provide? How can there be a true practice of prajna paramita if there is no change, if there is no purification? The same issues, the same problems come up with the claims made in the sutra that the sutra is actually directing at the Abhidharmikas. It may therefore seem, as Donald Lopez says that the Prasangika Madhyamikas, that is the Orthodox Tibetan schools, believe, that this sutra basically is pushing us to reject the notion of svabhava, of self-existence in particular. That is, that we can recover an idea of the Noble Truths, of the Eightfold Path, of dependent origination, of change, and all these things, so long as we exclude from them the notion of self-existence. That self-existence is the problem here, and as long as we get rid of that idea, then we're okay with these more normal Buddhist concepts. And that's probably from a philosophical perspective, and the Prasangika Madhyamikas are nothing if not philosophically astute. Probably from a philosophical perspective, that's the correct way to go. In a broader sense, however, if the Heart Sutra was simply about this concept, this Abhidharmic concept of self-existence, svabhava, then the Heart Sutra would basically be something of a tempest in a teapot, simply an argument over a single term. Then you might as well just tell people, leave out the term, don't accept that term, and then just go on with the normal understanding of the Dharma with that term excluded. We wouldn't need all of these words and paradoxes and contradictions to make that point. But I think that the Heart Sutra heralds something much deeper and more complex. Its claims and arguments are used in the greater purpose of Mahayana polemics against what they saw as a lesser path, and a substitution of new ideas of what nirvana was, what the path was. Now, Red Pine, as we started off with, says that the Heart Sutra is Buddhism in a nutshell. It covers more of the Buddha's teachings in a shorter span than any other scripture. Now, I think we can say that the Heart Sutra is the Prajna Paramita in a nutshell. It describes more of the views of the Prajna Paramita in a shorter span of words than perhaps any other sutra. But it's not Buddhism in a nutshell, because it explicitly excludes from its understanding much of the Buddhist Dharma. Or another way of putting this is to say that this sutra doesn't so much cover the Buddha's teachings as push them to one side or radically reinterpret them in the light of new understandings and new teachings. So the Sarvastivada notion of svabhava or self-existence became a kind of a scapegoat or placeholder for the entirety of an earlier understanding of the teachings, these teachings that are expressed as being part of the Hinayana or lesser vehicle. This lesser vehicle that was understood to be simply skillful means for those of lower ability and wisdom. In this sense, the Heart Sutra is best described as the lion's roar of the Prajna Paramita and of the ascendant Mahayana generally. Now, if you want to hear more about this idea of skillful means, in particular, so well described in the Mahayana Lotus Sutra, I'll leave a link to an earlier video on that topic up here on the screen, in case you want to see it. If you're getting something out of this discussion of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked up here on the screen and down below in the notes, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that I'm doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.